Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you all for watching. So in this video, what I want to do is talk about Harry Frankfurt's famous 1971 essay, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person. And what Frankfurt's trying to do in this essay, very famous essay, he's trying to build something essential into the concept of a person that involves thinking about the structure of the will. Okay, so that's a big picture project. This is important because many philosophers throughout the history of philosophy have tried to understand what it means to be a person in terms of being rational, okay, or exercising one's rational faculties and the like. And so Frankfurt's trying to say, yeah, those being rational may well be essential to what it means to be a person, but it's more. It's also having a certain kind of structure of will. So Frankfurt, like big picture, he wants to help us understand the notion of the will. He wants to help us understand what structure of will is going to be necessary for personhood, okay? And so I hope it's clear, just big picture, that Frankfurt and as many other philosophers have assumed human beings like you and I, there could be other beings as well in the universe. There could have been other beings in the universe that are such that we have rationality on the one hand, but we also have will on the other hand. We also have wills on the other hand, and so and there's some relationship between the two. The famous philosopher Immanuel Kant thought that the connection between reason and will was reason supplied the will with principles on which to act. Okay, there are other views that are out there, as one could imagine, but Frankfurt's in the tradition that thinks that reason and will is significant to the kinds of beings that we are. And he certainly thinks that reason plays a role in what's essential to being a person, but also the will. He thinks that that's been a bit underdeveloped and underspecified in the tradition, and so what he's trying to do here is he's trying to specify how it is that the will is essential to personhood. Okay. So, what is the will? So let's start there. What is the will for Frankfurt? The will is going to be first order desire sets that we wish to be effective. So at any given time you have a number of desires. Some of those you want to be effective, other of those you don't want to be effective. The desires that you want to be effective, the desires that you want to bring about, the desires that are sufficient to get you to act, those are going to be just identified with one's will. So note what this means. This means that you and I have wills. This means that non-human animals have wills, okay? And it would mean that if there were beings that were like us, or that weren't human beings even, that had sets of effective first order desires, that they'd have wills as well. So it's a very, very general notion. It's easy to talk about the case of you and I having wills, animals having wills, okay? But the idea is supposed to be more general than that, right? But any being whatsoever that could exist, which is such that they have effective first order desires, they have wills. Okay, so but that's not going to be enough to establish personhood, or say that there's an essential connection between the will and personhood as Frankfurt would like. And evidence for this obviously is because animals have wills, but they're not persons. At least the majority of animals in the animal kingdom aren't. At least it's what Frankfurt and others take to be true. Now, so that we need more complex structure when it comes to thinking about the will, in order to understand the notion, understand how it is that a person is essentially a certain kind of will. A person essentially has a certain kind of will, more accurately. So we need to think here about then having second order desires according to Frankfurt. So there's more complicated structure when it comes to thinking about a person's will. And so what it means to have second order desire just means that you have desires about your desires. So I have the second order desire, let's say, of wanting my desires to be more aimed at healthy eating, or just working out more, or studying more, whatever it may be. And so I can have desires regarding my desires in this kind of way. Same thing would hold true of you. Okay. Now, Frankfurt, he's skeptical that non-human animals generally have these kinds of desires. Okay, but having second-order desires is getting us closer to the essential connection between a person and the having of a certain kind of will. So having these second-order desires is significant. Now, what Frankfurt wants to claim is that it's entirely possible to have second-order desires, but that the first-order desire is one that not want to be effective, right? So he imagines the case of a physician. This is on page 9 of the text. He says, suppose that a physician engaged in psychotherapy with narcotics addicts believes that his ability to help his patients would be enhanced if he understood better what it is like for them to desire the drug to which they are addicted. Suppose that he is led in this way to have a desire for the drug. Okay, if it is a genuine desire that he wants, then what he wants is not merely to feel the sensations that addicts characteristically feel when they are gripped by their desires for the drug. What the physician wants, insofar as he wants to have a desire, is to be inclined or moved to some extent to take the drug. Okay, but then he goes on, but it's entirely possible, however, that although he wants to be moved by a desire to take the drug, he does not want his desire to be effective. Okay, so he doesn't want his desire, his second-order desire, to desire taking drugs to be effective, because he doesn't want his will to get out of control or something like that. He doesn't want to become himself drug addicted or narcotics addicted. Okay, so it's entirely possible to have a second-order desire, right, that involves a first-order desire that one doesn't want to be effective. Okay, but of course it's also possible that you can have a second-order desire, right, according to which that first-order desire you want to be effective. Okay, so I mean, imagine this physician's like, I really want to understand what it's like to be addicted to narcotics, so he forms a desire to have the desire to take drugs, and so he then starts taking drugs on the basis of that first-order desire. It was effective. He had an effective first-order desire on the basis of the second-order desire. That certainly could happen, right? It's certainly not recommended that a physician do that, but it's certainly a possible kind of case. So both cases are possible. Now, what's interesting here then is this allows us to make a distinction between different kinds of second-order desires. Those, according to which what comes with having the second-order desire is that the first-order desire that's associated with be effective. And then, of course, the opposite case is where you have the second-order desire, but you don't want the first-order desire to be effective. Okay, so here Frankfurt claims that one can have second-order desires which are second-order volitions. Okay, so among the second-order desires are going to be second-order volitions. So if you're thinking about things, big picture, you've got the general concept of second-order desires, and then you have one kind of second-order desire, which is second-order volition, and the other kind are going to be, we can just call them, for our purposes, Frankfurt doesn't call them those, mere second-order desires. Why? Because in the case of the mere second-order desires, there's no, in those cases, the first-order desire isn't one that the individual wants to be effective. Okay. So we have second-order volitions, and it's with respect to these second-order volitions, argues Frankfurt that we have the essential connection to being a person. So a person is essentially a being that has second-order volitions. So it's not enough that you have second-order desires to establish this essential connection between the structure of the will and personhood. Okay, so second-order volitions are essential to personhood, according to Frankfurt. Okay, so hopefully we see the big picture, what's going on here. Understand what the will is, very generally, define what that is, recognize that that's not sufficient for understanding an essential connection to personhood. So then we move to thinking about second-order desires, and thinking about mere second-order desires isn't enough, it seems, to get us to personhood, but thinking about second-order volitions is. Okay, so keep in mind that we have different kinds of second-order desires. It's the second-order volitions that are going to be the ones that are essential to personhood. So Frankfurt can claim that rationality is essential to personhood, but so is having second-order volitions. Okay, that's a big picture way of understanding Frankfurt, at least according to me, according to my interpretation of what's going on in the Frankfurt. Okay. Now, Frankfurt wants to help us see the difference between those who have second-order volitions and those who don't. And so he gives us a couple different examples. He gives us the example of the unwilling addict and the case of the wanton, as he calls it. And I'll get to the wanton in a moment. Let's deal with the unwilling addict first. So it's going to turn out the unwilling addict gives us an example of someone who has second order volitions, and so this individual is going to satisfy, right, that essential condition for being a person. So here's what he says. The distinction, this is on page 12 of the Frankfurt. The distinction between a person and a wanton may be illustrated by the difference between two narcotics addicts. So I'll get the idea of a wanton. A wanton is going to be a being that doesn't have second order volitions, it's going to turn out. And that could be because they lack second order desires. But set that aside for a minute. Let us suppose that the physiological condition accounting for the addiction is the same in both men, and that both succumb inevitably to their periodic desires for the drug to which they are addicted. So we're going to hold that fixed in both the cases. One of the addicts hates his addiction and always struggles desperately, although to no avail, against its thrust. Okay, he tries everything that he thinks might enable him to overcome his desires for the drug, but these desires are too powerful for him to withstand, and invariably, in the end, they conquer him. Okay, he is an unwilling addict, helplessly violated by his own desires. The unwilling addict has conflicting first-order desires. He wants to take the drug, and also wants to refrain from taking it. In addition to the first-order desires, however, he has a volition of the second order. He is not neutral with regard to the conflict between his desire to take the drug and his desire to refrain from taking it. It is the latter desire, not the former, that he wants to constitute his will. It is the latter desire, rather than the former, that he wants to be effective and to provide the purpose that he will seek to realize in what he actually does. So in the case of having a second order volition, you care about what your will is like. You want your will to be one way as opposed to another way. So that's another way of understanding what it would mean to have second order volitions, is you care about the kind of will that you have. Keep in mind what a will is, defined in terms of having first order effective desires. Okay? Now, in the case of the unwilling addict, okay, his second order desires that he forms desires not to take the drug, okay? But he also has this competing first order desire at the first order level. He's got this other desire that's saying, take the drug. I want to take the drug because he's an addict. Okay? And so we're supposed to imagine of this unwilling addict that he always succumbs to taking the drugs. That first order desire prevails. But he has a second order volition because he doesn't want that desire to prevail, that first order desire to prevail. He wants the other one to prevail. The other addict, Frankfurt continues, is a wanton. Okay? So this is supposed to be someone who doesn't have second order volitions. So understand a wanton as a being that lacks second order volitions. And that could be for various reasons, but for our purposes, let that suffice for now. His actions reflect the economy of his first order desires without his being concerned whether desires that move him to act are desires by which he wants to be moved to act. Okay? So here we imagine someone who doesn't care about their will. They don't care about which of their first order desires prevails. Frankfurt goes on to say it's just going to really be that is the first order desire that has the most strength that this person acts on. And he doesn't reflect on, he doesn't think about, oh, I want this first order desire to be effective, right? So he's in this individual's in a position where they're lacking for second order volitions, and it could very well be in many cases because they just lack second order desires. That could be a good what explains the case of the wanton, but it needn't, as it turns out. Okay, so hopefully we're understanding what's going on here. The kind of will that's essential to personhood, according to Frankfurt, is going to be having a will that one cares about, right? So one cares about the will that one has, and so one has certain desires about their first order desires and which are effective among them. Okay. So now, for someone like Frankfurt, he can say, big picture, what's essential to being a person is having rationality, having first order desires, having second order volitions, so not having second order, not merely having second order desires, of course. And then he goes on to say that there's a bit more, and this is where the idea of the freedom of the will kicks in. And so what I'm going to have to do is take that up in part 2 of this video series on Frankfurt, on freedom of the will and the concept of a person. So what I'll do is I'll stop here and I'll create a new video dealing with how freedom of the will kicks in. So thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll be right back.